Boa tarde a todos. Vamos retomar esta sessão da tarde. Eu vou agora passar a apresentação em inglês para a nossa convidada. So we are beginning this afternoon of our second day with the presence of Kate Walsh. Kate Walsh has served as the president of the National Council on Teacher Quality since 2003, and driven by the belief that relevant, broadly accessible comparative data can transform teacher quality, Walsh has spearheaded efforts to instill greater transparency and higher standards among those institutions that clearly exert their influence and authority over teachers. And I mean states, districts, teacher preparation programs. Notably, she produced first ever report cards on the quality of nation's teacher preparation programs, and I believe that Kate will tell us a little bit about those reports and the impact they had on teacher preparation programs in the US. Through her work, Kate has driven the demonstrable changes and improvements in how aspiring teachers are prepared for the classroom. A relentless advocate for equitable access to great teachers, Walsh's work has been widely featured in the media, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, the National Public Radio, and also on PBS New Hours, among many hours. Thank you so much, Kate, for being here with us. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to share your knowledge and experience. We are really looking forward to hearing from you, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
First, let me say how delighted I am to have received this invitation to come speak to you today. It's not often I get invited to fly across the pond, as they say. And I have to say, I skipped lunch and I went into walk in these beautiful gardens, which was food for the soul. It was absolutely lovely if you've not gone. So I'd like to begin my remarks today with a little analogy. In the United States, where COVID vaccines have been plentiful and available very early on, many Americans, as you may have read, opted not to receive a vaccine. That explains why the US has the highest death rate of any country in the world, next to Brazil. We've lost well over 1 million people, and some argue that it's probably more like 2 million. It seems no matter what is at stake, even if it is our own lives, we want to pay less attention to science than what our next door neighbor has to tell us over a cup of coffee or by scrolling through the internet. Now, I would say this is not a problem that is unique to the United States, though I will concede that the United States is more vulnerable and more susceptible to taking an ascientific approach on any front these days. We are legitimately frightened by what is going on in our country. But I think that here in Portugal or anywhere else, there is a tendency for us to put the science aside and rely on what our friends and relatives have to tell us or what strangers on social media have to say. And that's what brings me to our shared topic today. I would say, at least in the United States, that public education is particularly vulnerable to ignoring what is scientifically based, and sometimes with tragic consequences. And by tragic, I mean the many children who never learn how to read. And that's what I'm going to talk today about. I could talk about any other aspect of teacher preparation, but what I want to talk talk most about is illiteracy. So, illiteracy rates continue to be devastatingly high in the United States and elsewhere in the world. Because we speak English, it is a particularly hard language to learn, though I know that even in Portugal, it is hard to learn how to read Portuguese and to write Portuguese. So, before I launch in, just let me explain that I do not come as a teacher-educator. I'm not a researcher in reading. What I bring to the table is policy expertise. What my organization would do would be to look for policy solutions to problems that really challenge us and challenge our nation's public schools and challenge teachers. So that is the expertise I bring to the table today. I'd like to walk through why I think illiteracy rates continue to be so high, but the central premise of what I want to leave you with today is one of promise and hope. And I'd like to begin with this one thing. In the United States, illiteracy rates are at about 30%. Really, 1 out of 3 children fail to learn how to read well. We could bring that number down to 5% if schools were to change how they teach reading and if teachers were taught the methods that you need to teach reading that are based on what scientific evidence has to say. And that is equally true for Portugal. This is not something that poverty is a challenge, but poverty does not need to stand in the way of all children getting access to the one skill we all need to function as an adult. And if we don't choose to act, if we don't change what's going on in our schools, I don't know if any of you here, because you're probably all good readers, but there may be some people here who don't read well. And the consequences are devastating, as you might imagine. It is not just a matter of not doing well in school. People who do not read are much more likely to be incarcerated and end up in prison. People who do not read end up either unemployed entirely or underemployed, taking jobs which will only lead to struggles. This is the most important issue for all teachers and schools in the world. We must simply address our refusal to embrace what are scientifically based methods to teach reading. Now, to understand this problem thoroughly, I want to just present a little bit of data. Oops, sorry. Okay. Because if you don't measure a problem, you really have a hard time understanding the problem, and it's very easy to ignore the problem, okay? And I'm going to show you some statistics from the United States, which I hope will be useful to you here. So here is something I think everyone in Europe is quite familiar with, and this is a reading performance of 15-year-olds in the countries that administer the PISA exam. Now, I look at this as an American, and I say, we're 8th. Not bad. We are well above average, so do we really have a problem? And I would argue that this graph is particularly misleading to understanding the problem at hand. And may I assert, if you would forgive me, just to suggest that maybe Portugal, I think it's about 19th here, maybe you too should not look at this and say, well, we're above average, so we're okay. But I think what you need to do is to really dig into your data. Here is what is happening in the United States, not on the PISA, but on our national test called the NAEP. And you can see what tremendous variety there is across the country. The states that are in dark blue are the ones that are above average, and the states that are in light blue are the ones that are below the national average. Now, as an American, I can look at this slide and I have a very startling realization. There is one state, across the United States, the southern states tend to be the poorest states for reasons we can't get into now, but they tend to be the very poorest. There's one state in particular, the very poorest state in the country, that is not dark blue, but close to it. It's at the national average. I don't know if this has a pointer, does it? I don't think so. Yes. This state, Mississippi. So how is the poorest state in the nation able to compete with far wealthier places like New York or Ohio or Minnesota, where the poverty level is very low? Mississippi is so impressive. It is the only state in our country that actually improved their scores from 2017 to 2019. This is a remarkable slide, and it got everyone's attention in the country. What is going on in Mississippi? Let's look a little bit deeper. Here are some school districts in Mississippi and how they do on their state tests. Again, this is not the national test, this is their own state tests. And when you look at this, if I could show you comparison, which I don't have to show you, the school districts in Mississippi are doing much better than they used to. They're performing much higher. The lowest score is in the high 30s, but you can see, when you look at this, that they're all performing the average is pretty high. It's pretty impressive. And the reason for this is that a state law was passed. Now, I have to explain to you how America works, but we do not believe in a national curriculum, much to my chagrin. We do not have a national curriculum. In fact, we don't even have a state curriculum. We don't have 50 state curriculums. Every school district in the United States, that's some 13,000 school districts. Some school districts are tiny with only a few schools or one school. They get to decide what they want kids to learn. They get to decide how to approach reading instruction. It is a very anarchistic system that makes no sense, but the US is very much wedded to this idea. But on reading, it is changing. And it is largely changing because of Mississippi, the poorest state in the country. So what happened? How did a state law get passed that said all of our school districts have to teach reading using scientifically based methods? How on earth did that happen? I would like to tell you it was the government. But no, the government was doing nothing. The state of Mississippi was resigned to the fact that so many children in the state were not going to learn how to read. It was not the federal government. The federal government has no authority over education in the United States. It can require very little. It was not the schools. It was not teachers. It was one individual, a friend of mine named Kelly Butler. Kelly Butler runs an NGO, and they have some money to give away. A wealthy philanthropist gives her money to give away to get people to use scientifically based reading methods. Kelly is a reading expert. She's not a government official. She's just a person who cares deeply about underperformance and illiteracy in her state. And Kelly spent years, she is a dog with a bone. She spent years driving every educator and legislator crazy, trying to get them to change their ways. And Kelly is more persistent than anyone in the world, and she got a state law passed that said you must use scientifically based reading instruction in your schools. So Kelly is one of the few heroes I'm going to talk about today. Now, I want you to appreciate the significance of this next chart. These are the top 20 school districts in Mississippi in terms of their performance on their reading assessment at age 8. If you look at, on the y-axis, I've put the poverty rate. Can anyone, does everyone in this room think that poverty decides usually what happens to kids? There's a very, very strong relationship. If you come from a home where there are not many books, where your parents do not have a high school diploma, the odds of you going on and being successful are pretty slim. But this chart should prove to you, because there are plenty of schools on this chart that have a very high poverty rate. Some of them, there are 3 schools there that have 100% kids in their schools who are poor, 100%, and yet they perform in the top 20 in the country, in the state of Mississippi. So this is what happens when we address curricular issues. Now, the question I might have, though, is why aren't, if this state law passed and everybody has to use really good curriculum, why isn't everybody looking like these schools? Does anyone have the answer? The answer is our teachers. Yes, you can change the curriculum, and that helps tremendously. But unless you address the quality of teachers and the preparation that they receive in their own preparation in their institutions, you're going to have highly uneven performance. The reason that there are schools in the 40, 50, 60% level is because teachers have not been given the tools they need to get their students to where they need to be. It's not poverty, it's the importance of teacher quality. Let me show you the difference between a highly effective teacher and a highly ineffective teacher. This is a chart that's a little bit hard to understand, so bear with me and I'll explain to you. But we know that the average teacher tends to deliver 1 year's growth. By definition, that's the average teacher. But the teachers that are up there as exceptional, the top 15%, they tend to deliver 1.5 years growth in a year. And the teachers at the bottom, they deliver only half a year's growth. So the difference between a really ineffective teacher and a really great and a really exemplary teacher is a whole year of learning. This chart's from my colleague, Richard Starts, who's an economist at UCLA. And he, across the bottom, you can see that he says, you know, if we had kids who every year got a weak teacher year in and year out and nothing but, and you compare them to kids who got a really strong teacher year in and year out, there would be a difference of 6 years of learning by the time they finished secondary school. 6-year gap based only on teacher quality. That's an astounding difference, and one that should give us resolve to address teacher quality and closing the gaps that have been caused by the international pandemic, okay? So when we look at this, now, obviously, children don't get a weak teacher in every single year, and obviously nobody gets the very best teachers every single year, so that's hypothetical in that sense. But we do know that children who are growing up in poverty are much more likely to receive a weak teacher. So if we want to erase the disadvantages that come from poverty, we simply must attend to the quality of our teachers. Now, let me very briefly, and I'm not going to get into, because I don't think we have time, but I'd like to talk very briefly about the science of reading, just so you have a general idea, and I'll point you in the right direction of where you can learn more. But what is genuinely mystifying, as I said at the outset, is the science of reading has been settled. This is 25-year-old information when science reached a consensus, at least 25 years. So some of it goes back 50 or 60 years, the importance of phonics, but some is newer research. So we know there are 5 components to effective reading instruction. And this chart, I think, does a good job of explaining that in order to learn how to decode a word, does everybody understand decode? To learn how to read a word, you must have phonemic awareness. You must be able to hear the distinct sounds that are made by our speech. You must, and that's something that that's the newest component to this. And so when children come into school and they fail to hear that the difference between cat and fat, they have a phonemic awareness problem. They can't distinguish those sounds. And that's something teachers can remedy. There's also, of course, phonics, which I think everyone has heard of, and every reading program in the world says it teaches phonics. But I will explain to you that many of them really don't. And the third component of learning how to decode a word is you must be able to read fluently. Everyone in this room, when you read, you're probably not thinking about the words that you're sounding out in your head, right? It all happens subconsciously. That is what a successful reader does. They're able to read effortlessly. They don't have to think about the words, because what are they doing instead? They're discovering the meaning of what they're reading. And when you do not teach a child to decode, what are they doing? They're trying to figure out what that word is. They can't focus on the meaning, okay? And then, simultaneously to all this decoding, you simply must be working on vocabulary and comprehension. And for vocabulary and comprehension to grow, you must expose children to a lot of different kinds of knowledge. It is important for schools to have lots of science, lots of history, lots of topics that build children's vocabulary and understanding of the world. Now, most of my remarks today are focusing on decoding. I could give a whole long expose, perhaps Isabel, you could give a better one, about the importance of building comprehension. But it's this decoding thing that is really hanging teachers up. It is a definite problem. And I would just quickly add that there are other factors that have since emerged from the research that are also important. But I'm not going to get into all those right now, but I do want to refer you to this woman, another one of my heroes. Emily Hanford does not work for the government. She's not a teacher. She's not a reading researcher. She is simply a journalist. And she did a story a few years ago that has teachers and parents furious in the United States. She did an expose called Hard Words. It's a podcast. Please download it if you want to know more about this topic. But what Emily found out is what happens to kids who are deprived of the important skills they need to become a good reader, and what happens when a school actually changes its practices and starts to teach these things. Now, I'm going to leave you just with one thing. When I said before that phonics, everybody claims they're teaching it, but I don't know what happens in Portuguese schools, and perhaps you can address that for me. But in the United States, teachers are taught in their teacher preparation something called 3Qing. And 3Qing means when a child sees a word, they can guess at the word based on, there's a picture, so they go, okay, I'm looking at a picture of a horse, So the word must be horse. Or maybe the context of the story, so they anticipate the word. Or it may be syntax. But teachers are actually encouraged to children to guess at words. And this is the most damaging practice in American schools. I don't know if it happens here, but it is what you really need to do. In fact, there are reading programs that say if a child sees the word horse and calls it a pony, it's okay. So you see the problems that could lead to when there's no longer a picture next to the word for you to derive meaning from. So let me get into probably the most difficult part of this, and that is why has this science been so hard for schools to accept? And as I said, the root cause of this is how teachers are formed. And if you want to know why schools won't turn around, why so many teachers resist what is going on, is because this is how they were trained. And if you went through 2 or 3, 4 years of training, and you were taught to do one thing, and you get in a school and they say, well, we're changing the curriculum, and you can't do 3Qing anymore, and you can't do this, and you can't do that, you can imagine that that doesn't go over real well. And the principals, what do you call principal? The school headmaster? Head of school? The director, he too was trained in those programs. And so he too is more apt to say, we're not, this is not something that we believe in. This is the wrong way to teach reading. So what we have to do is look at why teacher preparation has been so slow to embrace these methods. And it goes back to the Enlightenment, actually. And a lot of people say Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Swiss philosopher, in his essay about his son, who he actually abandoned. So, it's questionable, but he abandoned this son that he writes about, Emile. And he portrayed a very romanticized philosophy of how children learn. And so a lot of people take that philosophy and they say, well, that is how children learn to read. For children to learn to read, you just need to give them books that interest them. That's not true. Children need to learn to decode. There are kids who would read if their teacher was wearing a paper hat and jumped up and down. If you come from a home where there have been a lot of books and a lot of high-quality conversation, the odds of you walking into a classroom and learning how to read no matter what happens are pretty good. If you come from a home where there are not a lot of books and the conversation has been mostly negative or not very limited, is much less likely that you will be able to go into a classroom. But there are kids who do come from homes with book-rich environments who still don't learn how to read, and that's called dyslexia. And they have but dyslexic kids and kids who don't come from print-rich environments, they both have the same problem. They need to be taught very explicitly how to read. So this romantic vision of how children learn has done tremendous damage on reading instruction. We also tend to want to imbue teachers with superpowers. We work very hard to say we are creating a professional. And I totally get that. In some circumstances, you absolutely want a teacher to have the autonomy to decide what is right for his or her kids. But we also don't do a very good job of preparing them. We certainly don't teach them how to write curriculum. Nobody teaches a novice teacher how to write curriculum. Curriculum needs to be written by experts. They need to be years of research. But nevertheless, when my organization began to look at what was happening in teacher preparation programs, we quickly saw that the number one approach to teaching reading in these programs across the United States was you will devise your own method to teach children to read. Only you can do that because every classroom is unique. So you will come in as a 22-year-old who's barely studied any of this stuff and who has never been exposed to certainly the scientific methods, you will decide what it is you need to teach children to read. And then the final thing is, that higher ed often is at odds with what's happening in primary and secondary schools, because higher ed to advance in academia is not the same as, we talked earlier today about training teachers. Many teacher educators really bristle at the notion that they're to train anyone because they're not dogs, they're not training dogs, but then we do train doctors, and we don't seem to have a problem with that. But you're not rewarded in higher ed for doing a good job preparing a teacher to be classroom ready. You're more rewarded for thinking new and important ideas. So there's a disconnect between the training and the delivery. So my organization, the National Council on Teacher Quality, we decided that we needed to do something about this problem. Now, this goes back to 2004. We were a new organization founded in 2000. We had no reputation to speak of. We had no authority. We had very little money. So what did we think we were going to do? Well, we were inspired by what happened with medical schools in 1910. In 1910, in America, medical training of doctors was awful. You could get into a medical school in the United States without even a high school degree or secondary diploma, and you would never even operate on a body, live or dead. You only read in a book what to happen. But in Europe, medical training was superlative. And so this guy went around, Abraham Flexner. This is the most famous social science study in the last century in the United States. He went around and rated all the medical schools in the country. And most of them didn't do very well. But after that rating, you saw massive change in what was happening in these programs, so that now you could argue that America has one of the best medical training in the world. And it's all due to that one study where they were rating those programs. So we decided that's what we would do. And to do that, in America, we have so many institutions. We literally had 2,500 institutions. So we spent 10 years trying to figure out how to do this. Now, you would be very correct if you said, who do you think you were? What arrogance that you think you could do this. And I guess, yes, you can accuse me a little bit of arrogance, but I also was so deeply troubled by a $7 billion industry that was not giving teachers what they needed. And that is something that we need to do something about. So there's a theme to this talk. There are people like Kelly Butler and Emily Hanford. None of us were in the government, because governments are not necessarily good at upsetting the apple cart. But governments do play an important role, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So we started this thing called the Teacher Prep Review, in which we rated every institution in the United States. And we rated them on these standards. This is what we do now. Back then, there's been a lot of changes, which you certainly do not want to hear about. But we are still continuing rating to this day. We rate every 3 years. Now, how do we do this? We have to get materials from programs. And it's very challenging to do that. There are laws in the United States which require public institutions to turn course syllabi over to us. So that helps us a lot. But it is not something the institutions wanted done, and they went to court with us. We had to have lawyers in 7 states. I had to spend $250,000 trying to enforce these open records laws. And it was very, very controversial. I've got a lot of knives in my back. But guess what? We're 10 years, came out with our first national review in 2013, and it's now 2022, and it is working. It is having an impact. Now, we've had an impact on, certainly on mathematics training, and especially in classroom management. We're looking for research-based strategies. Our teachers taught research-based strategies for managing classroom behavior. All this is online if you want to learn more about it. But the one I want to show you about is reading. Okay, so I'm going to show you what it looked like in 2013 and then up to 2020, and you see the growth. When we started, now these are the 5 components across the bottom: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Those were what we were looking for in these reading courses, that we examined the syllabi and we read every single textbook. We have had experts evaluate 1,000 textbooks that are in these programs. So you can see the growth. When we started, phonemic awareness was only in 1 out of 3 classrooms, but now it's up to 51%. We still have a ways to go, but you can see a slow and steady growth across all components. And you see that similarly in other things we're looking at. This method actually does change practices. And you know what? I don't blame the institutions one bit for resenting what we were doing. It's very, very hard to be rated, and we were not very sensitive to what their lives were like. I had no understanding of higher ed. I only understood higher education, I should say. I only understood K-12, and we antagonized them unnecessarily. But over time, we've mended fences, and there's been a huge difference in their cooperation. They now turn over materials to us, much more cooperative, and they really do welcome. They want to get a high rating. So now I'm about to finish, but I do want to say this one thing. The one thing that we have in the US that I don't believe you have here are licensing tests. And every teacher has to take a test at the end of their program to show they know something about reading knowledge. That's true in about 23 states. There's still a lot of states where they don't require a very good test, or they don't require one at all. But all that data was hidden. That's another thing my organization did. The US Congress tried twice to get this data that I'm going to show you, and it couldn't get it out of states. We finally did get it through working a lot with states. And the reason I want to show you this is the pass rate on a licensing exam in Arkansas. Along the bottom are different institutions in the state. And I picked this slide because I wanted to, again, return to this theme of poverty. A lot of people say licensing tests hurt people who are poor because they don't pass them at higher rates. In the United States, we say about black and brown college students have a much harder time passing these tests. But we showed that to be a myth. Not a myth, but we showed that there were exceptions, there were outliers. So these are the wealthier schools in the dark blue in Arkansas, and these are the very poor schools serving a lot of college students who make very little money. Now, if I'm the state of Arkansas, what I want to know is, what is this program doing? How do they beat the odds? And if this data hadn't been published, no one would ask that question. We would just say, poor schools always do worse. So anyway, we could get into that, but I think that's something that is really important. It helps to drive change if people have to pass a test of their reading knowledge, and then you can hold institutions accountable for achieving those results. So is what we're doing something that can be done in any in any country around the world? Obviously, there's the issue of getting materials, and that can be extremely difficult. But this is relatively inexpensive to do. compared to other efforts to improve teacher preparation. We rely entirely on philanthropic dollars in the United States to operate. And we're able to raise the money, but it's very difficult. We have to raise about $1.5 million a year, $1.5 million a year to do this work. But for a country with many fewer programs, it becomes much more of a realistic goal. I want to also say, and I'm happy to get into that, we made a lot of mistakes. We certainly made a lot of mistakes. And the biggest mistake we made was not giving the institutions the chance to review their scores before we published it the first couple times we did this, which was unfair to the programs, really unfair. And the other thing is, I wish we had done it anonymously the first time. So you begin to engender trust. So we made mistakes, but again, no one has ever done this kind of work in the country. So I guess that was inevitable that that happened. We also make sure that all of our standards are grounded in evidence. So nobody ever questions our standards. They know they are scientifically based. And then we always regularly refresh our ratings because that is what provides the incentive for programs to improve. So let me conclude by saying this. Every teacher in the world wants to succeed. I've never met a teacher who did not want to be successful with all of their students. But when we put in better reading programs into schools and we retrain teachers, there tend to be two reactions. Many teachers react with anger and hostility, and they only pretend to use the new curriculum. They still do what they always did, because they're deeply angry at somebody questioning what they've been doing for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Other teachers take it seriously, they give it a try, and they experience success at a level they never had before. And then they cry. Wouldn't you? If you'd been in a classroom for 15, 20 years, and you'd watched all these kids leave your classroom, and you were unable to teach them to read, but if you'd known what you now know, you would have been successful. So of course they cry. I think that this is a problem. There are many problems in the world we can't solve. This is a problem we can absolutely solve. We have to break some eggs. But with a little resolve, we can make this the last generation of teachers who ever have to experience this letdown of knowing that they could have done better by their own kids. So thank you for your time.
So I believe now we'll have a couple of minutes for some questions. Any questions from the audience?
Oh, I meant to put up my last slide in case anybody wanted to reach out.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Contact information. Oh, it's not up there anymore anyway. That was my contact information if you wanted to reach out.
Podem, se faz favor, colocar o último slide só para... Obrigada. Ok, já lá está. There it is. Any questions now? Or, yeah.
Thank you. I'm interested in particular in the Standard 7 around clinical practice. Could you tell us about the standard, the seventh standard on clinical practice? Could you tell us a bit about how you're measuring quality in clinical practice?
Very difficult. So we want to make sure that that there's a policy that the student teacher is assigned to an effective teacher. So right now in the United States, they tend to put student teachers, what do you call them, interns? Practice, the college learning to teach.
What we call in Portugal is estagiários. Some,
Okay, they
students
tend to put them in anyone's classroom as long as they've had 3 years of experience. And they will tell you that they have no choice because they can't find people to take they can't find people willing to do the work. I argue you should pay them, so, but that's another story. But the most important thing is that teachers are trained by someone who is considered really good. And the research on this is astounding. They know that if you are assigned to an exemplary teacher during your student teaching, that is equivalent to getting several years of teaching experience under your belt. So you don't, under your belt is an American expression, but it's equivalent to 2 or 3 years of experience. It's really amazing. This is work done by economist Dan Goldhaber in the US, who's looked at the powerful impact of student teaching when it's done well. We also want to make sure that the university visits the student teacher 4 or 5 times over the course of a semester. But the most important thing is, are they assigned to an effective teacher?
And there we have some more questions. The first one, thank you for your presentation. Is the work with students' families involved in the teacher training on literacy issues?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Do you want to elaborate? Go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering, because I believe that when teachers work with families, it boosts the learning of the students. And I was wondering, from your experience, if from teacher training, you talk about the power of involving families, considering the teaching to be.
I agree, there is strong research to suggest that working with families is very helpful to student learning. There are some things that we do not look at because we can't measure them. That does not mean they're not important. So for example, we have no standard on writing preparation to teach children to write. It is not something we could see in a syllabus. So we can't measure it. So you'll find a lot of things that I believe in very strongly that we think are very important, but we have no way of obtaining from a formal document.
The second question, I am not sure if you mentioned, but you envisage using other state sources other than materials from teacher training programs to establish the rankings?
Yeah. The reading standard is the only one where we rely on having to get a syllabus. Even mathematics, we have, over the years of a lot of trial and error, we have figured out how to do that without a syllabus, but based on a course description. And then we send our analysis to the programs, and the programs tell us, well, no, that's wrong or right, and then we correct it. So as long as we can produce an initial analysis that gives the program something to respond to, it tends to work very well. But for admission, we look at the quality admission standards, and that is something that's available on the website, what it takes to get into a program. We look at classroom management. We look at the evaluation form for the student teacher. Again, what's that word?
Yeah, the avaliação dos alunos.
And we want to see that they are requiring that student teacher to know certain strategies for managing student behavior.
Yeah. Yesterday I presented, as you all, the ones who were here yesterday, we presented a similar work following your work on teacher prep review. And one of the issues that was raised in our assessment was exactly the kind of assessment that is being described in the syllabus of each course, because most of the information is quite generic, because the field that the institutions have, it's very narrow, so they can't give a precise description on how they are assessing, what kind of knowledge and skills each student at the university has to be able to demonstrate that he's acquiring the required knowledge or skills.
So we will accept anything the university wants to give us, but we begin with the syllabus. And the syllabus, like, as you said, the objectives are useless to us. They tend to go on for 2 or 3 pages, the objectives for a course. We want to see how they're spending class time, what topics lectures are, and what the assignments are to students, and then what they're reading. Those 3 things, and whether they get any practice in how to teach reading. So that's what we're looking for from a syllabus. And if we don't find it, when we give our analysis to the program and they do have that evidence, then they turn it over to us and we accept it. But that's where we start.
Yeah. There's something very different. We could not do that following your work because most of the syllabus, your description you have in the US is very detailed. You can figure out the amount of time that in a certain course the students will spend studying, for example, phonics or studying phonemic awareness. And you can easily compute the amount of time that is being dedicated along all the program to that particular topic. We could not do that because here in Portugal, our description of each course are don't have that level of detail. So what we were only able to do up to now was to figure out if that content was present or not along the whole program. So we consider it was.
Well,
I'm just here to comparing what we did because
what you're doing is so much more doable. So it reminds me of what Kelly Butler did in Mississippi. She wanted to establish in much more detail than we could do for the whole nation. She wanted to establish what was happening in teacher preparation programs in Mississippi. And I think there are about 20 programs in Mississippi, not unlike Portugal. And so she went and she sat in on classes and she interviewed students who were taking the classes and she interviewed faculty. So there are ways to do it when you're dealing with a much smaller number that work beautifully and which are actually would be a better, ours is enough to give a sense of what's going on, but if you really want to understand what's going on, you need a much more detailed report.
So I'll move to the next question. If you could go back to being a teenager and you knew what you know today, would you go back to being a teacher?
Well, I am not a teacher, so you have to take that. I'm a policy person. We are not an organization that advises teachers. We look after the health of the teaching profession. So the people that we speak to tend to be policymakers who control teachers' lives. So that is my expertise. But I think teaching is, right now there's a lot written in the American press. I don't know if that's true here. There's a lot written in the American press how horrible it is to be a teacher. And they're saying that people are quitting in droves. Well, that's not true. The data do not indicate that teachers are quitting in droves. But I think actually, I tend to take a different perspective. I think a lot of people are unhappy in their jobs after the pandemic. I've seen people quit very, very good jobs after the pandemic, and I don't think teachers are, I think we have all had to, well, I retired, but, but I think that a lot of people have questioned the choices that they have made. And I don't think teachers are exempt from that questioning that we're all doing after the pandemic when our lives were so disrupted. But I do think teachers are having to go back into classrooms right now in America, at least you had school. In America, half of our schools were closed for a year and a half. And you can imagine the devastating impact on children's learning because of that.
And families' lives, probably.
Yes.
All of them. So the next question, how do you enroll, motivate teachers to be part of the program? Is it compulsory?
Depends on the school district, but it generally is. But as I said in my closing, a lot of teachers react very angrily to this being imposed upon them because it runs counter to what they learned. So they effectively sabotage the results. They will teach the parts of the new the new curriculum, which are the least important. And they'll ignore the parts that are most important. I don't know deliberately or not, but they really resent it, and they feel like it is questioning their judgment as a teacher. But I think teachers do come around when people begin to see the success. But I just do not want to leave you with the impression that teachers will embrace this completely. Now, that said, Emily Hanford, the journalist I was talking about, there have been many people over the years who have tried to talk about this issue. Emily Hanford spoke in some ways to teachers and to parents that no one had before. And you have seen a complete turnabout among teachers in America for wanting to embrace these methods. So it took one person who really, she had the power of a great podcast, and people listen to it and they say, oh, that could be me. So I think there's a Facebook, there's a Facebook page. What do you call it? I don't do Facebook. It's a Facebook page. It's called Science of Reading, What I Didn't Learn in My Own Teacher Preparation Program. And that Facebook page started during the pandemic, and it went from 0 to 180,000 members in a matter of 4 or 5 months. It's all teachers who are mad that they didn't get this in their own programs, and who are now trying to find a way to learn it.
Next question. How many states or schools use your rating system? Are there states which help you, for example, with funding?
We don't accept government money. We only do it from, we only get our money from philanthropy, and believe me, it's a hard job. But the states and schools are very much using our rating. I tell you, when we started publishing the licensing tests, even though that data came from the states had that data, they'd never looked at it. When we published it in a way that showed the huge range in performance, regardless of poverty level, regardless of whether they had a lot of black students or Hispanic students, when states saw the data sorted that way, we've had 2 states pass laws saying we're now going to use this in our accountability system, and others are following suit. So it's had quite an impact on state behavior. But yes, they do use it, but I think that that's what we always thought was going to have the most impact, that states and schools would use the ratings. I think in truth, the programs themselves have really welcomed this independent review. I'm not saying they all do. Believe me, we have our haters. There are plenty of people who really don't like us doing this. But over years, we've seen programs, because there is no formal governance in America for teacher preparation. It's very loose, and everybody does their own thing. And I think they have welcomed the idea that somebody says, well, this is what's scientifically based, and this is what should be taught to future teachers.
Was that, sorry, I just want to make that question. Was that ever, that belief that when you say scientifically based teaching reading programs, was that ever challenged by any of the institutions you were talking about?
Well, where we were...
There's always different...
Yeah, so very important here is that I had a slide, but I dropped it, and it showed you where we get our science from. And it's not stuff we invent. We get it. There's something called teacher practice guides that the federal government in America puts out, and they cover all sorts of issues. So what the research says about how people learn how to read, what the research says about how children learn mathematics, all these things. It's an invaluable resource, and they have independent panels that comb through the research and they synthesize it, and that is what we use for our standards. So yes, there are some people who still reject it. That happens all the time, but for the most part, it is not the standards themselves that were criticized.
Okay. I know we are running out of time. Just the last question. I think it is a very important one. Sorry for that. How to best change literacy teaching practices from the bottom up or from the top down?
Hands
From your
down, bottom
experience?
up.
Bottom up.
Because we tried doing this in 2000. It was a federal program called Reading First. Teachers did not buy in, schools did not buy in. It was federal government down to states, and it was supposed to filter down. And it did not, there was some very good impact from that program, so I don't want to completely paint it with one broad stroke. But what we're seeing now in America is teachers and parents are insisting that we do better. And that is really changing practice. It is not a movement led by governments, though government plays an important role, do not get me wrong, but it is a movement that is being inspired by parents and teachers.
Okay, thank you so much to all the audience for your very interesting questions. Thank you so much, Kate. It was very
Thank you for
helpful
having
us.
me.
Thank you.